Imagine standing on the bridge of an LST at dawn, fog crawling across a still green sea. The horizon is a smear of gray. The beach ahead is a pale ribbon. Lieutenant General Alexander Vandergrift watches, without ceremony, as 14,000 Marines prepare to go ashore. Their landing craft ride the swell like a mechanical tide. Behind them, engines hum. Rifles and packs wait in the dark. 250 miles to the north, over the smoking teeth of Simpson Harbor, an enormous, fortified Japanese base looms. Airfields, coastal batteries, miles of revetments and tunnels, garrisoned by a force estimated in the tens of thousands. Contemporaries called that complex Invincible. For months, the Allies had hammered it from the air and at sea. On paper, it ought to have been the theater's objective. In practice, it was a problem that refused to be solved the way wars are meant to be solved, by direct assault. This is the story of how the Allies neutralized Rabaul, one of the largest and most formidable Japanese bases in the South Pacific, not by taking it, but by refusing to take it. By late 1943, the debate moving through maps and staff rooms from Washington to Brisbane was no longer whether Rabaul could be captured. It was whether it had to be captured at all. Rabaul was not a single fort. It was a cluster of fortresses woven together by geography. Simpson Harbor, a natural deep-water anchorage, sat inside a ring of volcanic hills. Around that harbor, the Japanese had assembled a network of airfields. Levongai, Vunakanau, and other strips hardened with coral and revetments. Fuel depots hidden in caverns. Anti-aircraft batteries arranged to ring the harbor like jagged teeth. Coastal guns that could range at sea for miles. And, below the surface, a web of tunnels and dugouts that turned concrete and earth into a city of shadows. Engineers had carved storage and dispersal points into the volcanic slopes. Every runway had revetments, every revetment an alternate. By 1943, official Allied intelligence reported there were scores of aircraft on the ground at any one time, and by the autumn, the estimated troop strength in and around Rabaul had swelled to a force historians now describe as very large. Numbers often cited in post-war assessments place it above 100,000, although exact figures remain debated among scholars. The strategic problem was stark and simple. Rabaul was ideally positioned to threaten Allied operations across the Southwest Pacific. From its runways, Japanese aircraft could range over New Britain, over the Solomons, over sea lanes that sustained Allied advances. Its guns could interdict convoys. Its airfields could, in the right weather, lift sorties that checked an amphibious assault before it left the transports. When combined with the memory of other grinding island campaigns, tropical disease, dense jungle, fortified bunkers, the temptation to try to seize Rabaul by brute force became a calculable nightmare.
If you had to press forward across the theater, how many lives could you justify spending to take every fort the enemy had built? To understand why Rabaul appeared nearly impregnable, a few elements deserve emphasis. First, the scale and variety of defenses. Anti-aircraft batteries were layered, light guns to sweep low-flying attackers, heavier pieces to punish medium-level bombers, and fire control setups tied to optical directors and radar where available. Each airfield was complemented by dispersal revetments, earthen or coral walls that shielded aircraft from strafing and reduced the destructive effect of a single bomb. In many sectors, the Japanese had dug storage and personnel areas into the hills, fuel, ordnance, reserve quarters, protected from aerial observation and difficult to neutralize from the air. Coastal artillery sited on promontories could cover the approaches. Even if ships could maneuver into range, those guns made any direct naval assault costly. Second, the geography favored defense. The harbor's topography, the volcanic ridges, and the surrounding jungle created natural points of concealment and channels for resupply. Tunnels, some extensive enough to shelter dozens, absorbed bombardment and allowed munition and personnel throughput under the eyes of attackers. From these depths, the Japanese could repair, regroup, and return assets to action more quickly than bombers could destroy them. Third, the human factor. a professional, battle-hardened garrison supplied by a Navy and Air Force determined to hold the base as both a shield and a spear. Commanders in Tokyo and on the scene, their names appear in dispatches and post-war memoirs, arranged the labor, the fortifications, the routing of convoys. The result was a place that looked, to those who studied it from the air and the sea, less like a single target and more like a small, self-contained theater of war. From the Allied perspective, the temptation to try to reduce that theater by direct force was underpinned by earlier models of war. The interwar period produced blueprints, War Plan 712 among them, that assumed that decisive strikes and positional control mattered. Doctrine evolved with leaders and theorists sketching how to apply naval and air power in concert. But those same strategists also left a conceptual opening, the idea that not every enemy strongpoint needed to be seized to be made irrelevant. That particular claim, that an enemy position could be functionally defeated by being isolated rather than stormed, would move from theory into the center of wartime decision-making in 1943, under pressure from logistics, competing theaters, and bloody experience. The blood and metal experiments began in the air. For months, Allied planners attempted what healthy command staffs must try, to make the problem go away by attrition. Bombers returned to Rabaul in rotating waves, B-17s and B-24s, operating at the edge of their ranges. Long-practiced B-25 Mitchells conducting low-level raids and skip-bombing attacks. The airmen who flew these missions paid with men and machines. Aircraft were shot down in air-to-air engagements. They were shredded by concentrated anti-aircraft fire. Entire formations sometimes found their radios drowned by shell bursts and their formation integrity dissolved. On the ground, dispersed revetments limited the damage a single raid could cause. On some days, attackers returned to find runways cratered but quickly repaired. On others, they found losses that suggested they had paid dearly for only marginal effects. One of the most consequential episodes occurred in early October 1943 and has since become a marker in the narrative of Rabaul's resistance to aerial power. Brigadier General Kenneth N. Walker, a proponent of bold daylight bombing raids and an influential voice within the 5th Air Force, led, or at least endorsed, operations intended to unnerve and degrade Rabaul's ability to project power. Walker was an early and vocal advocate of strategic bombing in the Pacific. His operational courage was matched by a conviction that massed daytime attacks could break the enemy's will and logistics. During one such high-risk raid in October, Walker's aircraft came under withering fire. He did not return. Official records list him among those killed in action, and he was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Walker's death was a visceral, sobering reminder that doctrine and daring could be separated by a single burst of flak. Not all losses were at the level of senior officers. Among the airmen who tested Rabaul's defenses were dozens, sometimes hundreds of pilots and crews who logged mission after mission. Major Raymond H. Wilkins, one of many veteran flyers whose names appear in squadron rosters and casualty lists, was killed during the autumn operations. Accounts from unit histories note the cumulative effect of such losses. Experienced crews were irreplaceable, and the attrition of seasoned aviators inwardly reshaped mission planning more than any single loss would suggest. After-action reports, filed under the urgency of combat and often with the optimism of men who must justify their sacrifices, claimed successes: aircraft destroyed, runways cratered, enemy planes shot down. Subsequent analysis would ask more skeptical questions. How long would repairs take? How many aircraft were actually put out of commission? Which attacks produced lasting operational effects? And which merely returned the status quo ante with a heavier Allied burial list? The October and early November raids tested more than aircraft. They tested assumptions. Daylight bombing, the most audacious tactic for gaining precision against hard targets, relied on massed formations and mutual support. But Rabaul's defenders adapted. They used camouflage and dispersal. They repaired runways at night and masked damage with speed. Anti-aircraft gunners, armed with light and medium-caliber weapons, supplemented by heavier pieces, concentrated on choke points, approach corridors, and fuel depots.
Where bomb damage maps showed strikes, engineers and labor parties followed, improvising makeshift runways and clearing craters within days. The immediate tactical effects were visible, but the operational calculus, how much time, personnel, and resources the Allies would need to invest in repeated attacks to make Rabaul inoperable, began to look forbidding. There were striking moments of heroism and horror. On November 2, a series of low-level attacks, flown with the intent of hitting machines on the ground and wrecking fuel dumps, met ferocious resistance. Pilots reported intense, accurate fire from anti-aircraft positions and swarms of defending fighters. Aircraft that attempted to skim low across the strips found themselves in a kill zone. Losses mounted. After-action summaries filed in the days after the raids recorded both claimed hits on ground installations and significant U.S. aircraft and crew losses. Contemporary press dispatches and enclosed field reports sometimes celebrated tactical achievements. Operational commanders, however, began to tally a more uncomfortable ledger. For every runway cratered, the enemy could, in many cases, disperse and repair. For every group of planes destroyed on the ground, others remained masked, sheltered, or dispersed in a way of complicated, sustained neutralization. From the defenders' perspective, the Japanese command at Rabaul, Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka among them, watched and waited. Kusaka, a senior naval leader present in the theater, later put into his memoirs a sense of prolonged expectation. Supply convoys, air sorties, attempts at counterattack. The base's garrison was not idle. Repair parties moved at night. Crews shuttled fuel and munitions to protected caches. Cooks and engineers buried stores and cleared access lanes as attacks came and went. The Japanese had trained for defense in depth. Their response emphasized survival and continuity of operations. In the jungle hinterland, soldiers who would later be described in Allied accounts as part of the isolated garrison tended gardens and improvised stores. On airfields, flight crews tried to keep aircraft serviceable under the press of constant threat. Those mundane acts of survival, clearing shell fragments, patching canvas, reclaiming half-buried ordnance, were as central to Rabaul's endurance as the big guns and concrete bunkers. But endurance is also a function of supply, and supply depends on routes. Sea lanes exposed to interdiction, convoys that must thread air and submarine threats. As the Allies improved their ability to control the skies and harass surface lines, the calculus of keeping a large garrison viable began to change. Destroying or cratering runways helped, but what if instead the Allies could prevent the ships and transports that replenished Rabaul from ever reaching it? What if, rather than storming the fortress, the Allies could quietly turn it into a prison, a large, self-sustaining complex unable to affect the outcome of campaigns elsewhere? Those questions moved from planning cells into high-level deliberations in the months after the costly raids. Staff officers and theater commanders, tasked with balancing doctrine, politics, and the brutal arithmetic of casualties, ran the numbers. The earlier island campaigns in New Guinea and the Solomons were fresh evidence of how quickly a frontal assault could degrade both attacking force and the terrain they sought to hold. At Buna and Gona, in the swamps and within the mud, infantry paid for ground with blood and endurance. Cape Gloucester had taught similar lessons. Artillery and engineers could be decisive, but at the cost of time. In these campaigns, disease and jungle conditions claimed as many casualties as bullets, and the tempo of advance was slow. Those open wounds in the theater's memory made the idea of assaulting a heavily fortified hub like Rabaul look less like glory and more like a campaign that might tie down resources long needed elsewhere. It is important not to overstate any single figure or claim here. After-action reports by air units often celebrated the visible damage and claimed aircraft destroyed. Post-war historians have since revised many of those fatter numbers. Likewise, some contemporaries used superlatives, calling Rabaul the Pearl Harbor of the South Pacific, or referring to its harbor defenses as an unsinkable aircraft carrier. Phrases that captured the urgency and drama of the moment, but which must be read as rhetorical frames as much as precise military analysis. Good historical judgment requires tempering contemporary bravado with later scrutiny. Yes, Rabaul was a formidable, well-supplied base. Yes, it posed a serious threat to Allied operations. But whether that threat could be eliminated solely by bombing, or whether an amphibious assault would have been worth the likely cost in lives, remained the subject that would soon move to the center of Allied councils. By November 1943, Allied commanders were increasingly aware of three interlocking realities. First, that repeated air attacks produced local, intermittent successes, but rarely decisive, lasting neutralization. Repairs and dispersal limited the effects of singular raids. Second, that amphibious assaults, where they succeeded, demanded extraordinarily high resource inputs: ships, landing craft, specialized engineers and armor, and, above all, troops who would fight through jungles and bunkers. And third, that global commitments, Europe, the Atlantic supply lines, and Malaya, competed for priority. The United States and its partners were not fighting a single front that could be solved by throwing more bodies at it.
Choices had to be made. As the raids of October and early November accumulated into a catalog of heroic losses and ambiguous tactical gains, a new idea gained traction: consider bypass. Rather than continue the attritional contest for a place that could be repaired overnight and reinforced by sea, could the Allies interdict its supply lines, build forward bases closer to the objectives that mattered, and let the fortress slowly atrophy into a strategic backwater? The argument was not about shirking responsibility or accepting the enemy's will. It was a calculus in which lives, time, and shipping freight were variables on a larger equation. Those debates, at first technical and then political, unfolded across staff briefing rooms, in cramped maps rooms where men bent over curves and compasses, and in higher councils where national priorities were weighed. They were informed by doctrine, pre-war plans that had toyed with the idea of bypassing strongpoints when cost outweighed benefit, and by the fresh, painful experience of recent campaigns. The memory of General Douglas MacArthur's push in New Guinea, the actions of Vice Admiral Halsey's fast carrier task groups, and the stubbornness of Japanese resistance formed a backdrop to clear-eyed, if uneasy, thinking. Sometimes the most effective way to defeat a stronghold is not at the point of its defenses, but at the arteries that keep it alive. Before those debates reached their decisive moments, however, more strikes would be flown. Carrier groups and bomber formations would again test Rabaul's guard. Among the naval commanders tasked with these dangerous experiments was Rear Admiral Frederick C. Sherman, whose carrier task forces undertook strikes designed to disrupt shipping and naval elements in Simpson Harbor. Carrier strikes could bring sudden, concentrated power to bear, and on November 5, a carrier-based operation would catch parts of Rabaul's surface fleet, cruisers and transports, at a moment of vulnerability. Reports circulated contemporaneously of cruisers hit and some surface units damaged. But the larger point remained. Damage could be done, but not necessarily at a sustainable pace that justified the losses suffered to achieve it. Back on the beach at Bougainville, as landing craft ground toward sand and men prepared to disembark, the strategic picture remained unsettled. The Marines and their commanders were, by necessity, focused on the next immediate challenge: establish a lodgment, secure an airfield for fighter cover, protect the supply line. They understood that 100 miles of ocean and the presence of airfields still in Japanese hands could confine their operations. They also understood that an all-out assault on Rabaul would divert forces needed to consolidate gains closer to the line of advance. The human stories threaded through these strategic calculations were not abstractions. They were pilots who climbed into cramped cockpits and took off into a sky wreathed with enemy guns. They were veteran commanders whose reputations and lives were at stake. They were soldiers in the jungle who would, weeks or months later, find themselves confronting the consequences of decisions made in distant rooms.
Brigadier General Kenneth Walker's name appeared in casualty lists and in the citations of a nation that mourned leadership lost. Major Raymond H. Wilkins's squadron roster echoed with the absence of a man who had lived and flown long enough to be considered seasoned. Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka's later memoirs would offer a vantage point from the other side: the experience of supply shortages, the daily management of a base under threat, and the patient calculation of waiting out the enemy's pressure. As the days of November advanced, a quieter, less dramatic form of warfare began to gain adherents. It was not a matter of fireworks and medals. It was meticulous, grim, and governed by spreadsheet sensibilities. Establish fighter sweeps to deny air superiority. Crater runways and then interdict the repairs. Use submarines and patrols to menace supply convoys. Build a chain of forward airfields closer to the real objectives, and then, slowly, let the great base become an expensive liability to the enemy. That idea, if properly executed, promised something historians and commanders did not say lightly: the possibility of winning without pouring blood where the cost was unjustifiable. It represented a departure from some conventional expectations of warfare. It put a premium on mobility, logistics, and the integrative power of air, sea, and submarine interdiction. But turning concept into practice required proof. The Allies needed an operational experiment that would show bypass was not cowardice, but a valid instrument of strategy. One that could be applied across the theater to accelerate advances while conserving the most precious resource of all: trained lives. The next few weeks would supply that experiment. What planners wanted was not a single spectacular victory, but a sequence of operations that would demonstrate, practically and decisively, that a fortress could be neutralized at range. If Vella La Vella, carrier strikes, and a bold amphibious move on Bougainville could combine to throttle Rabaul's reach, then the theater's calculus might change. If they failed, the Allies would have to face, in grim arithmetic, the human cost of an outright assault. The pilot case arrived in the Solomons months earlier, but its lessons were only now being tested at scale. Vella La Vella, a green island tucked among the archipelago, had been the site of a deliberate bypass in August and September 1943. Rather than waste large forces on the heavily defended neighboring island of Kolombongara, Allied commanders chose to land a smaller, mobile force on Vella La Vella's less contested shores and force the Japanese to adjust or be cut off. The operation was tactical in scale but strategic in implication. Bypass could work, not because it denied the enemy a strong point immediately, but because it offered a way to sever their operational options without subjecting Allied troops to attritional cost. On Vella La Vella, the mechanics were straightforward and unglamorous. Landing craft slipped ashore under cover of night, engineers moved quickly to secure limited beachheads, and light forces seized terrain that denied the defenders key approach routes. Rather than grinding through fortified positions, the Allies interposed themselves between the Japanese garrison and its supply lines. Japanese units on the bypassed island were left with choices that were cruel in their simplicity: withdraw by sea under constant threat, attempt to resupply along contested lines, or remain and slowly wither. In many cases, they stayed, and in staying, they became operationally impotent. That practical lesson shaped what came next. The Allies would not merely repeat Vella La Vella. They would scale its logic to a theater-wide plan. The first visible, kinetic element of that scale-up was sea-based air power. Carrier groups could bring concentrated, mobile airstrikes to points the land-based bombers could only reach intermittently. On November 5, 1943, a carrier strike under Rear Admiral Frederick C. Sherman turned the Navy's fleeting reach into a tool of attrition against surface units and harbor facilities. Aircraft from the carriers hit ships in Simpson Harbor, and, according to contemporaneous reports, cruisers and transports suffered damage. The strike did not remove Rabaul's threat in a single afternoon, but it showed two things: that the harbor's surface units were vulnerable if surprised at the right moment, and that naval aviation could keep pressure on the lines essential to the base's survival. Carrier strikes were dangerous, however, and their benefits ephemeral if not integrated with sustained interdiction. Strikes could crater a pier or damage a ship, but unless follow-on measures denied repair, replacement, or resupply, those successes were temporary. That reality pushed planners toward an operational cocktail: carrier strikes to harass and attrit, land-based airfields to maintain daily air superiority within range of Rabaul, submarines to menace convoys, and localized amphibious operations to create closer bases that would shorten logistics and give fighters the endurance to patrol continuously. That amphibious ingredient arrived on the morning of November 1, 1943, when 3rd Marine Division elements steamed toward Empress Augusta Bay on Bougainville.
Lieutenant General Alexander Vandergrift's landing force, 14,000 men in a single, concentrated push, was not aimed at Rabaul itself. Instead, it secured terrain from which the Allies could build a lasting presence within fighting reach of the Central Solomons and the sea lanes that fed Rabaul. The objective was soberly pragmatic: take a position where airfields could be constructed quickly and where fighters and medium bombers could be based at range to threaten Japanese movements to and from Simpson Harbor. The beaches of Bougainville were a means to an operational end, less a decisive prize and more a keystone in the architecture of isolation. Engineers moved with a speed born of necessity. Within weeks, the scrub and sand of Empress Augusta Bay were transformed into coral-surfaced runways and dispersed revetments. The art of rapid airfield construction, leveling, coral surfacing, and the placement of revetments was the unsung centerpiece of the bypass strategy. A forward airfield shortened response times and multiplied the intensity of fighter patrols. Air superiority, in practical terms, meant that bombing raids could be escorted to their targets and that Japanese convoys would face a liberation of airborne threats from dawn to dusk. The combination of fixed airfields and mobile carrier forces changed the tempo of interdiction. Where once the Allies had struck Rabaul with punishing but intermittent pressure, they were now building the infrastructure for sustained, daily fatality to supply lines. The operational mechanics of isolation deserve careful unpacking because their apparent simplicity concealed technical choreography. Fighter sweeps, continuous patrols flown at various altitudes to intercept enemy sorties, removed the Japanese ability to conduct effective reconnaissance and to provide fighter cover for convoys. Runway cratering operations, often carried out by medium bombers and dive bombers, targeted the very arteries that allowed Rabaul's aircraft to sortie. Craters did not need to be permanent. They only had to be frequent enough to force repair crews onto a defensive reactive cycle. Allied planners understood that as long as runways were continually denied safe operations for longer stretches than the enemy's repair cycles could manage, the functional sortie rate would drop. Submarines and air-delivered torpedoes put convoys under continuous threat. A convoy could attempt to steam to Rabaul under cover of night or in coastal waters, but submarines prowled those lanes in growing numbers. Merchant vessels, critical for fuel, food, and numbered reinforcements, faced a gauntlet of sea and air attack. When supply lines are exposed, the calculus of any garrison changes. It becomes a contest of endurance, not of firepower alone. A technical term worth pausing on is skip bombing, a tactic refined in the Southwest Pacific under General George C. Kenney's air umbrella. Skip bombing involved low-level attacks where bombs were released to ricochet across the water into the sides of ships, an approach that traded altitude for precision and required extraordinary skill from crews. It was dangerous and effective in constrained waters where larger bombs dropped from high altitudes lacked the necessary precision. When combined with fighter suppression and coordinated timing, these methods made convoys riskier and less reliable. George C. Kenney himself, commander of Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific, played a formative role in adapting air doctrine to the theater's specific demands. Kenney was neither a theoretician in the narrow sense nor solely a technician. He was a pragmatist who matched technique to environment.
He prioritized low-level attack profiles and aggressive interdiction that accepted risk in exchange for operational effect. His stewardship helped translate the abstract logic of bypass, cut the arteries, into tactical procedures that could be taught, rehearsed, and executed with lethal regularity. At sea, Admiral William Bull's fast carrier task forces provided the strategic mobility that kept Japanese commanders on edge. Halsey was not the architect of bypass doctrine, but his willingness to use carrier power aggressively created the conditions in which isolation could be made continuous rather than episodic. Ships and carriers patrolled contested approaches. Their aircraft added capacity to crater runways, hit convoys, and suppress the defenders' ability to mount effective sorties. All of these moves, airfield construction on Bougainville, carrier strikes, submarine interdiction, and continuous fighter sweeps, began to take visible effect. The flow of materials into Rabaul slowed and became riskier. Crash repairs to runways were possible, but the increased air presence from the newly constructed forward bases and mobile carriers meant such repairs could be interdictable. The Japanese command, already stretched by multiple fronts and limited in merchant shipping and escorts, found it harder to keep the flow of supplies both timely and adequate. From Rabaul's side, the consequences accumulated painfully. Vice Admiral Jinichi Kusaka, who had overseen naval operations in the theater, recorded later reflections of a base that was simultaneously resilient and increasingly isolated. Repair parties worked under the constraint of night movement and camouflage. Convoys were rerouted and often delayed. Food stocks, fuel dumps, and spare parts, once replenished on predictable schedules, now faced attrition en route. Men in the garrison improvised. Jungle gardens, salvage stores, and rationing stretched supplies. Local scavenging became a daily occupation. As the supply lifeline frayed, what had been a formidable strike hub became, operationally, a large and costly pocket. Human vignettes, once more, illuminate what those strategic shifts meant on the ground and in the air. Walker and Wilkins had already been named among the fallen. Their losses signaled the risk that Allied airmen endured in trying to reclaim aerial dominance. Across the ocean, Vice Admiral Kusaka and his staff balanced orders from Tokyo against the reality of dwindling ships and delayed reinforcements. General Douglas MacArthur, whose command responsibilities in the Southwest Pacific made him invested in a steady forward push, argued for operations that would keep momentum and maintain political and moral visibility. General George C. Marshall and the Joint Chiefs, charged with global priorities and the allocation of scarce resources, leaned toward decisions that would get the most strategic leverage from finite means. The bypass decision thus emerged from a convergence of different pressures, political, logistical, and moral. That convergence was formalized in policy and practice. The Quebec Conference earlier in August 1943 had served as a forum where the weight of global war was measured. There, planners and chiefs graphed out what could be achieved against what would be prohibitively costly. Marshall's influence was decisive in the sense that he framed the problem within a global portfolio of resources and asked which operations would return the most strategic value for the least long-term cost. But in keeping with the careful collective pattern demanded by the DNA, it must be stressed that bypass was not Marshall's lone invention. It was the outcome of a layered consensus. Senior staff work, theater experience, and practical tests like Vella la Vella had all pushed toward the same conclusion. Over the winter and into 1944, the operational pattern hardened. Allied forces continued to strike Rabaul, but increasingly those strikes were designed not to annihilate the base on site, but to inhibit routes and prolong repair cycles. Convoys that had once steamed directly into Simpson Harbor were rerouted, delayed, or intercepted. Some were simply deemed too hazardous to dispatch. The Japanese attempts to maintain the garrison grew costlier in tonnage and risk. Escort vessels that once protected supply ships now faced a higher casualty rate. And the availability of fuel for air operations at Rabaul diminished as tankers failed to make the journey in sufficient numbers. By mid-1944, the cumulative effect of sustained isolation became grimly apparent. Historian estimates converge on a figure often cited in post-war accounts. On the order of 100,000 Japanese troops remained within the perimeter of Rabaul and its environs, effectively cut off from meaningful reinforcement. That figure, widely repeated though disputed in detail, helps convey scale without pretending to exactitude. What is less open to debate is the functional status of the garrison. Increasingly constrained, increasingly dependent on improvised food and medical care, and progressively limited in its ability to project offensive power beyond the harbor's immediate surrounds. The condition of the isolated forces was a byproduct of strategy and geography. Disease and malnutrition became chronic problems. Tropical illnesses taken casually in rear echelons became lethal in the field where supplies failed to arrive. Allied reconnaissance reported improvised gardens, the increasing visibility of foraging parties, and the gradual reduction of sortie rates from the Rabaul airfields. Australian forces, which later accepted the surrender of isolated troops, would describe scenes of emaciation and scarcity, material signs of long-term neglect rather than of decisive annihilation. Such outcomes raised painful moral questions. Leaving tens of thousands effectively stranded was not a comfort to commanders who remembered the faces and letters of those who had been taken ashore in earlier battles. For some, bypass felt like a pragmatic cruelty. For others, it was the least brutal alternative to a bloody frontal assault that would have exacted a heavy toll on Allied forces. Historians who have revisited the decisions tend to frame the bypass as an ethical dilemma as much as a strategic one. A choice to accept the suffering of those cut off rather than to force a direct and possibly larger slaughter. This is not a judgment the military made lightly. It was a call made in the context of an interconnected global war. Operationally, the bypass doctrine's success in the Southwest Pacific encouraged its application elsewhere. Once the Allies had demonstrated that a fortified bastion could be rendered strategically impotent by a combination of forward bases, interdiction, and maritime pressure, the technique became an available option in subsequent campaigns. The capture of the Marshalls and the Gilberts, the landings in the Admiralties, and the later bases that supported the push toward the Philippines and Japan all exploited the notion that control of supply lines and basing rights could be more decisive than occupation of every enemy strongpoint. Again, it is important not to overstate the bypass's singularity. It was one of several tools, including sustained naval blockade and strategic bombing, that together altered the Japanese capacity to wage war. The immediate human toll of bypass, both among those forced to remain inside Rabaul and among the Allied airmen and sailors who continued to pressure the base, stamps the narrative with somber gravity. Men like Brigadier General Kenneth Walker and Major Raymond Wilkins are names in a catalog of loss that underlies the strategic analysis. Vice Admiral Kusaka's memoir reflections underscore that, from the Japanese vantage, the isolation was a process of attrition almost as cruel as any assault, waiting for convoys that never came, and watching a formidable base lose mobility and life support. In assessing the net strategic effect, historians caution against overly neat conclusions. After-action reports and contemporaneous claims frequently enumerated aircraft destroyed, piers blasted, or ships damaged. Later scholarship has revised many of those figures and urged a cautious reading of wartime accounting. Where unanimity is easier to find is in a more qualitative judgment. Bypass altered the theater's political and operational dynamics. It allowed Allied forces to accelerate toward objectives that mattered more for the final defeat of Japan, and to do so with fewer men killed in direct assaults on heavily fortified positions. Many historians judge that the decision to bypass Rabaul and similar strongpoints likely spared substantial Allied casualties, though estimates of precise numbers remain debated and should be cited as estimates rather than certainties. The legacy of the decision extended beyond casualty math. It reshaped doctrine about the relationship between offense and logistics, and it pushed naval and air planners to think in combinations of persistent presence and surgical interdiction, rather than only in terms of decisive battles. The integration of carrier mobility, forward airfield construction, and submarine warfare helped define modern joint operations, an operational marriage of mobility and denial that was a direct descendant of the strategic choices made in the Solomons. And yet, in the intimate terms that history grants to memory, there was no parade for the prudence that forestalled bloodshed. The men spared from a frontal assault did not march into public recognition as heroes. Their survival was a quiet fact of logistics and judgment. The doctrine itself, while praised by many of its practitioners, remained awkward in moral terms for those who considered the fate of the isolated. It is one thing to save lives by refusing to fight. It is another to accept responsibility for the prolonged suffering of those left behind. Commanders gave different answers depending on perspective. Marshall and the Joint Chiefs framed bypass as necessity. Theater commanders balanced operational success against local moral burdens. And survivors, both Allied and Japanese, carried private reckonings. Returning to the image with which this story opened, consider again that dawn as ships approached Bougainville. Vandergrift's Marines moved ashore into an operation that could have been undermined from the north. Instead, their success depended on a broader strategy that consciously chose restraint in one place in order to achieve mobility and advantage elsewhere. The fog of morning water hid not only the ships, but the complex moral geometry of the choices behind them. In the months and years that followed, the Invincible label hung over Rabaul as an emblem of what could be neutralized without occupying.
The fortress remained intact in many physical respects. Runways scarred but serviceable in patches, stores hidden in tunnels. But it ceased to matter when measured against the sequence of Allied operations it could no longer influence. The long retreat of Rabaul from operational prominence did not, finally, depend on a single raid, a single amphibious landing, or a single officer's memo. It resulted from a cumulative shift. Tests like Vella La Vella, carrier strikes under Sherman and others, the establishment of forward airfields on Bougainville and nearby islands, the interdiction of convoys by submarines and air, and the steady pressure of fighter sweeps that reduced sortie rates over months. Those practical measures, combined with a strategic willingness to accept a different form of victory, one based on denial rather than conquest, changed the map of the Southwest Pacific. What the campaign also left behind were questions that refuse simple answer. Did bypass shorten the war? Historians answer that bypass was one among several important steps that preserved Allied momentum and resources. It was influential but not singularly decisive. Did bypass save lives? Many historians assert that it likely did, though precise figures are contested and morally complex. What did bypass ask of commanders and citizens? It asked them to accept the slow attrition of isolated men and to trust that operational advantage in other theaters would translate into a better overall outcome. When, finally, Australian and Allied forces accepted the formal surrender of the isolated men at the end of the war, they encountered the material mark of that attrition: overgrown runways, tunnels filled with time, and troops who had subsisted through improvisation. There were no triumphant parades for the doctrine that drove this outcome. Instead, there were burial crosses, medevacs, and the slow logistics of repatriation. The tactical contours of victory were as much private as public. The doctrine worked, but its human imprint was mixed. Lives preserved in aggregate, suffering prolonged for others, and a somber ledger that historians and descendants would parse for decades. The greater lesson, perhaps, is the humility of modern strategy. The choice to bypass Rabaul reframed the ethic of warfare in that theater. The willingness to accept operational denial as victory required a blend of patience, technological coordination, and moral accounting. It demanded that commanders weigh the immediate illusions of glory against broader, quieter gains. In that sense, the untold aspect of Rabaul's story is not that the fortress was destroyed, it was not, but that its power was broken by subtraction rather than conquest.
Across the Pacific campaigns that followed, planners in Washington, Melbourne, and Brisbane carried Rabaul's lesson into new plans. Forward airfields, mobile carriers, and submarine patrols became routine instruments in an integrated campaign toolbox. Warplan 712's pre-war speculations about bypass found wartime validation not in the rhetoric of military theorists, but in the muddy coral of Bougainville's runways and the blackened hulls of intercepted convoys. The strategic legacy was real, a doctrinal shift that privileged economy of force and logistical leverage over symbolic conquest. Sit with the image one last time. The morning light on the Macaulay's Bridge fell across Vandergrift's race as Marines went ashore, a scene both ordinary and extraordinary. In the distance, Rabaul did not erupt in the decisive firefight many had predicted. Instead, it receded, not by defeat in battle, but by circumstantial attrition and strategic will. The theater's maps were redrawn not by the capture of every fortification, but by a sequence of decisions that recognized where force could do the most good. That recognition, cold, pragmatic, and costly in ways that numbers cannot fully capture, changed the course of campaigns and saved lives in ways invisible to the daily headlines of wartime. If you found this deep dive illuminating, consider liking and subscribing for more long-form military history. Share this episode with someone who loves operational detail and moral ambiguity in equal measure. To close, the defeat of Rabaul's operational power was not a spectacle of flames and triumphal banners. It was a study in denial, engineering, interdiction, and the quiet persistence of forward basing. Its lesson is both tactical and ethical. Sometimes the most decisive victories come not from forcing the enemy's walls, but from cutting the lifelines that sustain them. The fortress that once seemed invincible lost that label not because it was stormed, but because it was made irrelevant. And in that slow, methodical undoing, strategy and humanity met in an uneasy truce. Which untold decision in WW2 surprised you most? Leave a comment and tell us which example of strategic restraint or audacity you want us to explore next.